Have you ever heard how a child's heavy breathing can drown out the whispers of the most influential people in Europe? Thick clouds of incense swirled through the marble halls of Madrid's Alcazar palace. It was burned around the clock in an attempt to drown out the stench of dampness in human bodies, the bolts of locked cells, the creaking of leather covers, the muffled moans of sick courtiers. From the ceiling hung tapestries depicting biblical scenes, where crowned saints stood side by side with demons, and angels and trumpets froze in silent roll call, as if reminding Charles II's court that heaven was watching their every move. And yet, what was being prepared here took place far from the light of stained glass windows and the ringing of bells. Rumors of a miracle child reached the capital late at night, when the courtiers were still sleeping off their feasts. "A baby with the body of a giant," whispered the valets, hiding their candles in the darkness. Monks in heavy woolen robes on the covered altar talked about a divine sign, and the court physician Narcissus, tormented by his own prejudices and illnesses, shuddered when he heard the report of the senior valet. Somewhere in the north, under the gray ridges of the Cantabrian mountains, there lived a 9-year-old peasant girl whose hands were heavier than a cannonball and who grew faster than a grapevine on a sunny slope. Messengers reported that neither court jesters, dwarfs, nor other freaks of nature could compare to her. Charles II barely lifted the corner of his weary lips. In that glance, one could sense the despair of the ruler, one of the last Habsburgs in Spain, who believed that any new entertainment would distract the people from the cracks in the empire and the holes in the royal treasury. The order came down like lightning: bring her here as soon as possible. Less than an hour later, the royal seal was already being stamped on parchment with a stark revelation: a miracle child has been found. Deliver her at the earliest opportunity. Court artists gathered in the palace to discuss their palettes. What shade of red should they use to paint her image to make the girl look even more impressive? The perfumer Julita mixed myrrh and saffron essence into the incense to mask the sharp smell of her heavy breathing, and a tailor in a white robe estimated how much bright linen would be needed for a robe so that her body would react even more powerfully to the light under the crystal chandeliers. Scissors and needle cases jingled in the maids' belts, and behind the walls of the Alexander Hall, blacksmiths roared. The wheels of the carriage had to be covered with iron so as not to break on the potholes of the royal roads. Meanwhile, far to the north, in the Burgos Valley, in a tiny hut with a creaking thatched roof, little Eugenia's parents were putting her to bed. They could not have imagined that at that very moment fate was weaving invisible threads of the royal decree around their stove. No one suspected that the road to greatness was paved with heavy human sighs and groaning wheels. If you enjoy these peaceful stories about history, please subscribe to the channel. It's free and helps me continue. Early in the morning, the most enduring Mustangs were being unsaddled at the stables of the Alcazar. The quartermasters checked that the carriages were not overloaded and the wheels were already grinding against the stone pavement. Near the heavy gates, beggars stretched out their hands toward the passing carriage. They had stopped complaining about hunger and cold when they heard whispers about the new royal entertainment. The majestic bell on the main tower struck noon, as if measuring every minute until the arrival of the miracle. Servants flitted through the halls, removing covers and polishing the bronze sconces to a shine, where the little, magnificent guest was soon to stand. Behind the heavy doors, someone played the violin softly. A young musician was rehearsing a new concerto that was to be played when she appeared. To someone unaccustomed to court life, it all seemed like a theater of the absurd. Somewhere, in a remote valley, a little girl was suckling intently, while in the heart of the Alcazar, an inexorable anticipation hung over her. Only the old court physician, surrounded by dusty folios, dared to whisper a prayer for mercy. He had seen too many unusual freaks and disabled children not to understand that behind the loud word miracle often lay indescribable pain and suffering, but his whisper dissolved in the hollow stone vault, and the dull footsteps of the royal guard announced that the caravan had already set off northward. Thus began a story where luxurious velvet serves as a screen for cruelty, the muses hold their breath, and admiration turns into a cage. The king's order was carried out, the path was open, and every mile of the road stretching from Burgos to Santiago became an invisible thread in a fateful web. And one day, this girl, who was named Eugenia, the noble-born, would cross the threshold of the throne room, and her name would ring out louder than any choir. Imagine a girl who, at 2 years old, weighs as much as a strong plowman, but stands on thin, barely grown legs, and doesn't even grimace from fatigue. Every evening, her father would re-nail the boards of her old cradle so that it would not fall apart under the weight of the child, and her mother would wash her thin shirt, which stretched time after time like a sail in a squall. At first, the neighbors crossed themselves secretly, avoiding Eugenia's house, but soon they stopped whispering. Her father and mother talked so loudly, as if trying to drown out their own fear. Some called the girl a gift from heaven, others an ominous omen. At a fair in a nearby valley, innkeepers wrote in pencil on a blackboard, inviting people to see the miracle from Burgos. And from then on, the news made its way to the capital. By the age of 2, Eugenia weighed as much as a grown plowman, but she stood on tiny legs like a young oak tree, which seemed even more incredible. She did not cry from exhaustion, but laughed as if she was unaware of her strength. Only at night, when the fire in the hearth was smoldering, did her mother hear a faint, hoarse sigh, as if someone's invisible hand was squeezing the girl's throat. Local healers advised bloodletting and leeches. A witch doctor recommended a wormwood decoction to remove the excess flesh, but nothing could extinguish the fire inside her stomach. Her brain never received the signal that she was full. When Eugenia turned 6, the village children would gather in a circle and watch with bated breath as she swallowed a whole loaf of rye bread in one gulp, almost choking on the flour dust. Some laughed, some looked away in pity, but every time the girl fell silent and reached out for another portion. Her hunger sounded like continuous music, the rhythm of which no one could stop. Her father sold part of his vineyard on the slopes of Rioja to invite a doctor from Belbava, a small town where doctors already knew about her unusual appetite. The doctor who arrived frowned, called the child a divine curiosity, and wrote a prescription: an infusion of cinnamon, wine vinegar, and morning dew, voluntary restrictions that, in his opinion, should quell the fire inside. But even after a year of treatment, Eugenia could still eat 3 bowls of boiled barley for breakfast. One day, in a peasant tavern crowded with travelers and merchants, a Jesuit preacher told a Madrid tax collector who was passing by about this girl. A month later, 2 royal envoys in elegant frock coats, the attire of court gardeners from Levray at the time, stumbled upon the mountain village. They politely asked Antonia and her husband to come out to the road. They carried a thin scroll of parchment sealed with red wax bearing the royal seal, whose scent filled the air more strongly than any incense. Antonia could hardly suppress a shudder. Her heart pounded as if her little girl were learning to walk for the first time. The caravan slowly moved through the April gorge, where rain lashed the flimsy footbridges. To turn the heavy chariot on the narrow path, the envoys even cut down the railings. Eugenia sat among straw cushions, calmly chewing on bunches of grapes handed to her by the guards. Their task was to slow her down, but they only increased her appetite. In every village, curious glances clung to the wheels. old men crossed themselves, lamenting a miracle of God or a curse, while jesters with outstretched hats offered coins for a glance. But the royal seal is always stronger than the curses and superstitions of the crowd. When the caravan approached Madrid itself, the morning fog mixed with the black smoke from the smithies, and suddenly, on the banks of the Manzanares, behind the huts of the craftsmen, the majestic towers of the Alcazar appeared. The convoy stretched out into a long chain, resembling a procession of troops after a triumphant victory over the Moors. Eugenia, exhausted from the jolting, pressed herself against the wooden railing and saw a palace for the first time in her life. "Why is the house so tall?" she whispered. The servant, taken aback, simply remained silent. The ancient gates creaked open, and before them, guards with silver breastplates and lush feathers bowed in solemn silence. The girl believed she had come to a celebration. With a broad smile, she lit up the air with the spark of childlike joy. This smile shocked the court ladies. Their eyes met with amazement and fear. Too much life shone in the face that was soon to become the secret treasure of the crown. At that moment, as if from the semi-darkness of the chapel, the sovereign himself stepped forward. He was white and emaciated, but with the eyes of a child eager for games and sweets. He came closer, looked closely at the tiny fingers peeking out from under the lace hem, and in a quiet voice uttered the nickname that had stuck to the girl like a brand on the finest pottery, Monstrua. No drums sounded, no candles went out. Everything happened so quietly that the feeling of whispering filled the air with a special poignancy. Sometimes fate changes not with thunder, but with a barely audible whisper. The journey was over. The performance had begun, where the auditorium and the cage became one and the same space. Ahead lay scarlet velvet curtains, a scattering of sugar almond dragis, and thousands of eyes eager for a new miracle, unaware of the price of this sweetness. While the scenes of the first audience were whispered in the corridors, the sound of scissors could already be heard in the inner workshops of the Alcazar. The tailor Don Alonso unfolded a bolt of purple brocade before him, thick, with a velvety front as if soaked in cherry syrup. "Sciarrino," he grumbled to the servants, and they carried rolled-up bolts of fabric from the shelves. There was enough fabric for 3 wedding dresses. Monstrua's costume had to enhance her silhouette and fill the space so that the court ladies, laced into whalebone corsets, would look like fragile porcelain figurines next to her. Meanwhile, in the hallway, which smelled of fresh linseed oil and freshly mixed paints, the artist Juan Corren de Miranda was setting up his easels. He moved them across the wooden floor, trying to catch the cold northern light that could bring out the nuances in the model's face that the yellow glow of the oil lamps mercilessly blurred. It was under this light that little Monstrua was to appear before the monarch in her best light, becoming the new wonder of the royal court. Have you ever seen a living picture? In the halls of the Spanish palace, little Eugenia appeared before the courtiers as a living miracle, at once delightful and slightly terrifying. He hardly spoke, only occasionally tapping his finger on the birch bark and moving his lips as if trying to decide which shade of umber, that very Italian pigment from Umbria, would best emphasize the moist gleam in the child's eyes, which already betrayed the weariness of an adult woman. But before the brushes touched the canvas, Eugenia had one more ritual to undergo: her transformation into a marvel worthy of the canvases of the Flemish masters. The royal hairdresser carefully combed her thick hair with a silver brush, each stroke accompanied by a barely audible sigh. The strands quickly became saturated with sweat, and the shine had to be concealed with rice powder, which a maid sprinkled on her temples. The powder made her skin matte, almost marble-like. The girl did not resist. She had long understood that immobility shortened the longest hours. While one group of maids tightened her corset made of whalebone, another set out refreshments on the tables. Dishes with honey and candied dates stood next to a jug of thick chocolate, just brought from New Spain. King Philip IV never tired of repeating that his miracle must never go hungry. The guests had to see her greedily accepting the treats, as if embodying the inexhaustible abundance of the Spanish crown. And so the hour of the first public demonstration arrived. Huge mirrored doors with gilded frames creaked open, revealing a hall where hundreds of candles were reflected in crystal chandeliers, as if the night sky had descended closer to the people for a moment. In the center, among gentlemen in ochre-colored doublets and ladies in light blue ceremonial robes, stood a chair on wheels with carved legs. Maids rolled it up to the arch, and Eugenia, wrapped in folds of red and white satin, was bathed in the glow of hundreds of lights. Whispers, sighs of amazement, and muffled laughter behind lace veils. Some people crane their necks, others avert their gaze, as if afraid to touch this strange grace. Under her corset, her chest trembles, her breathing becomes heavy, but her exhalation is almost silent. But the girl has learned to hide any effort. Without betraying the slightest tension, she meets the applause. The king himself, sitting on the throne, clapped loudly, and the hall resounded with the first chords of a minuet. No one asked her to dance. Her immobility is the main performance. Little jesters in colorful caps whirl around the chair like planets around the sun, but all attention is focused on her. On the ivory armrest lies a silver tray with marzipan figures symbolizing strength, care, and sacrifice. A lion, a griffin, and a pelican. When Eugenia picks up a figure, the hall falls silent. Her every movement seems choreographed, like a living allegory. Then comes the second act of the performance. Tiny, almost transparent valets are led before the audience, carrying bouquets of roses sprinkled with rose water and orange blossoms. Dwarf harlequins juggle lollipops, luring the girl, while the laughing king interjects witty comments about the generosity of nature. Laughter rolls in waves, but some of the courtiers show flashes of disgust, for this show is both delightful and shocking. Meanwhile, behind the screen, the artist is getting ready. He has been given only a few days. The king demands that he capture this living image forever. In the studio, the smell of fresh linoleum mixes with roasted walnut oil and the slight sourness of nitrogen brought in by a breeze from the garden. Eugenia sat on a high stool, her legs dangling in the air, so a velvet cushion was placed beneath them. The artist spoke quietly, almost affectionately, removing the girl's heavy dress and asking her to keep her gaze straight and smile slightly, so that the whole world could see her confident compassion. But the brush, barely touching the canvas, betrayed his fatigue. The shadows under her eyes and the fine network of red veins on her cheeks could not be hidden, even by a thick layer of rouge. While the first canvas was being created, gossip was already circulating in the palace about the second, a natural portrait. The servants wondered whether to remove her dress, but the artist insisted. The king wanted to see two sides, splendor and horror, so that he could admire and flee at the same time. How he loved to watch the storm from the safety of the loggia, breathing in the scent of wet earth without risking getting wet. When the day of the second session arrived, the studio was curtained with a light linen cloth so that curious courtiers could not enter. Eugenia was allowed to leave a thin silver chain with a medallion of the Virgin Mary around her neck, a sign of royal favor. The girl stood barefoot on the slippery wooden floor, the cold creeping from her heels to her shoulder blades. The artist placed a sprig of green grapes in front of her, so that the purple berries would set off the pinkish tone of her skin. The berries glistened like her body, filled with juice and a secret that the mind could not contain. The king glanced in for a moment, looked closely at the contrast, and left. For him, the main intrigue was just beginning. Have you ever wondered how the human body is turned into a royal exhibit? The chief court sculptor nodded, placed a gold ducat on the table, and left the workshop as if to say, "Let history preserve this truth." When the door slammed behind him, the hall was filled with a hollow silence, and only the scribe rustled the parchment. He carefully recorded the circumference of the chest, the waist, height, and weight, dry figures that would outlive the model herself. In the evenings, when the whispers of the courtiers died down in the marble halls of the palace, Eugenia returned to her tiny dwelling. It was neither a resting place nor a closet, but something in between, a bare bench, a thin mattress, and a draft that brought the smell of smoke from the fireplaces in the council hall. A maid helped her remove her heavy velvet dress. Red stripes stretched across the skin under her corset, like the mark of a ruler. Then a wooden bowl was brought into the room with thick soup made of chickpeas and beef tails, as fatty as a monarch's privilege. Eugenia ate slowly, holding back her hunger, not wanting to turn every spoonful into a theatrical performance. Sometimes she would get up in the middle of the night and pace the cold marble corridor until she could make out a narrow strip of sky above the crenellated roofs through the bronze bars. There, in the distance, the lights of Madrid twinkled. The torches of the guards on the Segovia Bridge, the night lamps at the doors of taverns, reflections in the waters of the Manzanares River. The girl listened. Were her peers laughing there? Was anyone dreaming of escaping from the gaze of strangers? With the first rays of the sun, the palace was once again transformed into a theater. The Tuscan ambassador and his wife followed along the wide gallery, along with Flemish lace merchants and a priest with a naturalist who collected wonders of nature. At the head of the procession was a guide who spoke in a slow, rehearsed voice about the common origin and age of the Spanish pearl and the king's touching gift. The guests sighed with delight or looked serious, as if reading a plaque in a museum. And when they left, the last minutes in which Eugenia existed for them, not as a person but as a rare artifact, disappeared with them. All that remained was emptiness, the heaviness of her body, and the loud music of her own heart, for any silence in the Baroque corridors echoed with the footsteps of a wild beast. Year after year, the dressmakers made the cuts more complicated. Each new outfit required more silk and embroidery than the previous one. Doctors, taking measurements, argued whether the girl was growing from overeating or from the diabolical heat that had settled in her blood. But no one suggested walks in the gardens of Buen Retiro or light gymnastics. Why lighten the load when it was the main part of the spectacle? One spring evening, as the rain drummed on the stained glass windows, Eugenia heard two court ladies talking behind the door. One spoke admiringly of an albino boy and his dwarf twin from the Prussian estates, while the other sighed tenderly, "But our Spanish gem is still immeasurably more precious." The girl couldn't resist. She quietly crept up to the door and touched the cold bronze handle. At that moment, she felt for the first time that she was standing on the edge between herself and the whole world, as if the handle held the key to a freedom that did not exist. By the age of 12, Eugenia woke up more and more often with sharp pains in her joints, as if rusty screws were slowly being screwed into her bones. Her steps became shorter, her dresses wider, and her corset turned into a merciless straitjacket. The courtyard was deaf to her suffering. Every fold of fabric, every deepened sigh only intensified the drama of the spectacle. One day, when the orange trees blossomed in the gardens of Buen Retiro, the girl was brought to another performance in front of Neapolitan guests. She could barely hold her head up straight. The ribbons in her hair pulled her neck so tightly that the apartment seemed like a burning collar. The musicians played a court zarzuela, but the ambassador leaned quietly toward his wife. "How beautiful! It hurts my heart." This quiet phrase was the first alarm bell. For the first time, attention was focused not on the effect, but on the cause. Small signs of fatigue multiplied, and the artist, finishing another portrait, almost faltered when he noticed the blue circles under the girl's eyes. The doctors prescribed bed rest, strong wine and almond milk. The wine lulled her to sleep, the milk gave her strength, and the great wheel of court entertainment continued to turn, fueled by her invisible hunger. Soon the king ordered himself a new toy, a ferocious bear brought from the Polish forests. But Eugenia's story is not over yet, and perhaps one day someone will dare to look at her not as a curiosity, but as a person who was never allowed to choose her own destiny. On a dark Madrid night, the bear raised a silver cup to thunderous applause, and the girl on the stage suddenly realized that this glitter would one day melt away like wax on a burnt-out candle. Eugenia Martinez Vallejo came to the court of Philip Thurfor not from a noble family, but thanks to her rare talent. She performed gymnastic tricks alongside trainers and trained bears. Every evening, she would take to the stage in the throne room, where the scents of lavender and rose essences brought from the palace greenhouses wafted around her. The noise of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, the rustling of velvet draperies, all this became a familiar backdrop for her. But one day at a reception, something happened that changed her life forever. During the ceremony, her heavy costume skirt caught on a stone step, her corset cracked at the seam, and Eugenia froze in mortal terror. The crowd gasped. The applause died down. Tailors rushed about trying to mend the torn seam, but the fabric would not budge. Servants hastily covered her with screens, and the king, fearing scandal and a breach of court etiquette, forbade her from appearing at the festivities that evening, citing the need for extreme caution. From that moment on, her days of semi-seclusion began. Eugenia woke up only at dawn, but sleep brought neither rest nor relief. Her lungs ached with fatigue, her joints creaked like old beams in an abandoned chapel. The palace doctor advised her to keep a bottle of fragrant cherry blossom infusion at her bedside. If her breathing suddenly faltered, the drops would serve as a temporary respite. The cause of her illness was never determined. It was far more important to the court physicians that the royal routine not be disrupted. A few months later, Eugenie was practically forgotten. She was no longer invited to festive dinners, and only dry references to an unusual girl who once entertained the people in the hall remained in embassy diaries and chronicles. Meanwhile, the artist whose paintings adorned the palace walls was putting away his recently finished rolled-up canvases in his studio when his gaze suddenly fell on one of them. On the slightly blurred surface, he thought he saw the figure of a girl in an elegant dress, on which the gloss of the lacquer paint was still visible. He bowed to her quietly, as if to a living being. So firmly had her tired but proud posture lodged itself in his memory. On one of those restless March mornings when the rain on the glass resembled faceless tears, the wardrobe supervisor glanced into Eugenia's room and left almost immediately, closing the door behind him so quietly as if afraid of disturbing her sleep. On the same day, a few dry lines appeared in the inventory journal. The scarlet brocade dress was to be returned to storage, the pearl bodice to the treasury chest, and personal jewelry to the court jeweler. A long dash in the name and property column cut the girl in half. All she had left was her property, and she herself seemed to have vanished from history. There were no lavish funeral ceremonies. A short mass was quickly said in the chapel of St. Juan above the church altar. Servants began to sort through the ribbons and lace in the chests, and officials in black robes filed past the doors of her chambers, leaving behind only a faint smell of incense and candle soot. The palace continued to live its life. The tall tower clock in the Scarlet Dome counted down the hours of new receptions, gossip, and intrigue. Decades passed. The paint on the portraits gradually darkened, the varnish cracked, but the eyes on the canvases, painted with the finest layers of azure and lead white, still catch the viewer's gaze with their chilling calm. Some guests stroll by, admiring the rich drapery of Philip IV's coat, while others hurry on to the next room. Only a few pause before a strange portrait of a girl, feeling an almost physical reproach emanating from her unmoving gaze. At the end of the 20th century, a young endocrinologist named Andy Krennick, studying the old paintings under the bright light of lamps, suddenly noticed a characteristic distribution of body mass, narrow palms, and a clearly defined bulb above the upper lip. He said aloud what 17th century medicine could not even formulate: Prader-Willi syndrome. A year later, his article appeared in a prestigious medical journal, and the world learned that behind the anatomical mystery lay the story of a child whose body was as afraid of going hungry as her soul was of being unnoticed. Historians, inspired by the retrospective diagnosis, rediscovered the dusty folios of court inventories and found a dry entry for the return of all dresses in the name of Eugenia Martinez Vallejo. In museum storerooms, they found a letter from the artist apologizing to his friend for the harsh necessity of conveying the truth with every brushstroke, even if it upset someone. So gradually, between the crackling of old varnish and the lines of worn treatises, her forgotten name resurfaced. In the Spanish city of Burgos, a bronze figure of a girl in a ball gown was erected, with every fold reproduced with precision. A tiny mouse settled at the feet of the sculpture, a reminder that beneath the thunder of history, small lives rustle, dreaming of a crumb of bread. Tourists stroke the tail of the bronze rodent and, inadvertently touching the hem of the dress, feel a subtle connection between simple curiosity and genuine compassion. Today, the portrait of Eugenia Martínez Vallejo hangs in the museum hall, not as a curiosity, but as a mirror of an era where, alongside solemn masks and rich drapery, the fragile truth of human destiny is visible. The guides no longer limit themselves to describing the rich colors and thick velvet drapes. They tell the story of a girl whose gaze has outlived kings, favorites, and the artist himself. What if the child's silence is louder than any ovation? The familiar questions are already being asked on her stage. Do you feel tired? Will she echo in your eyes? The audience nods. Some turn away and hide the tremor in their voices. But instead of the brilliant nickname under which she was advertised on the posters, a human name suddenly appears: Eugenia. It is enough to take half a step back to take in the whole picture. Scarlet ribbons in her curls, silver paint on her white face, the reflection of the entire hall in her transparent eyes. Even in the days of Louis XIV, children with unusual appearances were brought to the royal chambers, and in England in the mid-19th century, P.T. Barnum staged the first freak shows. The audience applauded enthusiastically until these children were forgotten as human beings. Today, such performances have long been condemned, but echoes of that passion for spectacle live on. In this silence, a new rhythm is born. In the distance, the applause dies down, and in Eugenia's chest, a quiet, persistent heartbeat sounds, reminding us that greatness fades when dignity is forgotten. She no longer begs for bread, seeks approving glances, or waits for the king to clap his hands. Eugenia speaks for herself, with a silence that clearly conveys the ultimate truth. The miracle is not in the unusual shape of the body, but in the right of every child to remain human, even when the world is hungry for new spectacles.